Okay, hello. This is part two of musical theater. This is where we last picked up, which was with the WPA and the Workers uh, Progress Administration Program, or Works Progress Administration, or Works Projects Administration. Remember from the last pick, we talked about how the people were given work through a stimulus package, which allowed them to get paid using taxpayer money to do such a thing. So this takes us into the Golden Age, which flourished from 1943 to 1968. There were three elements of the Golden Age, but we will not talk about them in detail. The Golden Age was essentially the time period within this 20-year period where musical theater was at its busiest, not only on theater stages, but all over the country, and also on the movie screen. By this point in 1943, we obviously have talkies, and you can hear the actors, and they're no longer silent movies. Also, look over, you'll see where I've listed the team Rodgers and Hammerstein. Rodgers and Hammerstein was a duet, a lyricist, which is a person who writes the words, and a composer, who is the person who writes the music. During this time of the Golden Age, you'll notice that there are several hundreds of these teams of men who worked together, and they were called lyricists and composers who did this. Rodgers and Hammerstein is the more popular couple because they really kind of got things going. They were part of creating what is known as the book musical. The book musical is the type of musical that really exploded during this time period of the Golden Age and is what is known as the musical. A book musical is essentially a musical that has storyline with acting, storyline with music, storyline with dancing, storyline with singing, all of it written for the story, and all of those elements move the story along. The songs told the story, the acting and the dancing told the story, the music moved the story along, etc. So there were a lot of elements that were part of what happened with Oklahoma in 1943 that really set off the basis for how the book musical that was created here in our country would move on. Um, Without getting into too much detail, obviously, as soon as movies could take place with sound, the movie musical became a very popular item. Uh, Here's just a list of a few of them. But theaters now had ways of showing theater pieces, not live, mind you, but filmed as a movie on screen. This created a larger popularity with musicals. Now, if you go back, you remember our gap went from 1866 with the original musical, The Black Crook, and we don't have anything, of course, until after the Great Depression, and then, of course, we talked about the WPA, where we had established theaters and buildings set from the Federal Theaters Project all over the country. So a lot of those places allowed people locally to go see live theater, and they did not have to make their way to Broadway. But another way that they got to see theater was on screen. Movie musicals were very popular. You don't have to go any further back than something like The Wizard of Oz, which still was in that movie musical realm, even though it was 1939 when that film came out. But the idea and the concept of movies and musicals wasn't strictly from the Broadway stage, but most of it all came from the vaudeville performances. Even if you look back at cartoons like the Looney Tunes and Bugs Bunny, you will always see that mentality of the silly slapstick behavior and songs that would occur, hence the term cartoons or character tunes. And so this idea falls in line, of course, with what a musical is. But again, this golden age is what really kind of sent it off into the stratosphere. There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of musicals made through this process, as we note here, from 1943 to 1968. So you can Google and find these all over the place. The poorest attempts, of course, was that horrific film Cats that just came out, which was horrible from the beginning. If you get a chance to see it live, it's a beautiful show. But that and you have an example of that on the paper that I sent you. And so the play, of course, is a movie musical, but that's kind of the dissemination, is that if it's going to be a movie musical, it has to be made from a movie standpoint. Plays aren't really meant to be seen on screen because of the behavior and the challenges that they present. This is a name to be familiar with, Stephen Sondheim. He was one of the more famous writer-composers that came out of musical theater and our music theater history. You've probably seen some of his work, but one of the more poignant things about Stephen Sondheim was that he tended to go into a darker realm with his plays. Most musicals, and he wrote for the theater, were tended to be more upbeat, tended to have happy endings. That book musical, in that world of Golden Age musicals, tended to always have a positive outcome. Things were always done in a lighthearted way, even though in Oklahoma someone does die, but it's the bad guy, things like that. Stephen Sondheim was popular for taking stories and creating stories, and his music to really take on a tone of a darker twist. A great example was the Into the Woods, where he handles the story of Cinderella, the baker and the baker's wife, and Jack and the Beanstalk. And the whole first act is their story of the fairy tale, which we all know very well. However, in Act 2, the play takes a darker twist where people die, and people are learning about lost relationships, and people are separated, and things of that nature. It's kind of like the life after the happily ever after. He wrote that musical based on a book about the AIDS and HIV epidemic that flourished in the 80s, and obviously had its time during the 90s, and it's still a contending disease right now. And so there was a lot of movements for plays about AIDS and HIV plays at the time, but Sondheim was very realistic in his work. So he was a poignant writer and someone to be familiar with. Here's a list of 5 of his other shows: Company, Follies, A Little Night Music, Sweeney Todd, which was made into a movie with Johnny Depp, you may be familiar with, and has a very darker twist to it as well. Assassins, being about the several figures in history who were assassins of famous presidents. Okay, so in 1956 we had Elvis Presley. During the time people were worshiping Elvis Presley, the singer, the rock star. He was the king of rock and roll. And then the British came along shortly thereafter in the late 50s, early 60s, with kind of like the rock band. And the Beatles was the most popular one. And they called that the British Invasion. And the British Invasion was the British imposing their twist or their idea of rock and roll onto our country and culture. And of course we accepted it, and the Beatles became all the rage. And today now we have a mixture of both. We have the single performer like the Elvis Presley, Justin Bieber. We have the Beatles like U2 or 21 Pilots, any of those bands that are now groups. So it's interesting how we have that British invasion. I bring this up because the British also invaded us in musical theater. We had what was going on with the basic book musical that we had created here and that was founded here. And then we had a movement where the British took part in the process of their fare of Broadway musicals or musical theater, and most of that was driven by the style of operetta. The biggest movement of the British musical style was that there was not really any talking or dialogue. So we have talking, we have dancing, we have singing, we have dialogue. The British came in with their movement and style that we've actually adapted more so in musical theater. You do see both now, so they both coexist, but the British did also have their way and style that they brought into our way of musical theater. Andrew Lloyd Webber is probably the most important example of that. He was the writer of Cats, Phantom of the Opera, the two big ones that everybody knows about. We talked about Jesus Christ Superstar. You saw that example. And many more that he took part in, and his style really just took over Broadway. So any picture, photograph you see of Times Square Broadway, you're going to see Cats up there. You're probably going to see Phantom of the Opera, still alongside with some of the old reliables, but it really did take over Broadway. So this style also was a movement that connected musical theater to popular music. So the standard musical that was a book musical stood around the classical music. The movement of the British invasion with Andrew Lloyd Webber and Victor Hugo's Les Miserables also handled that style that was more popular music, and we could connect to it, which is one of the reasons it became more popular. Here's just a couple more examples of other shows that came along out of that, and these styles were not just of realistic stories or comical stories, even though they did tend to find themselves in a realistic historical mindset, or there was a serious story about it. It wasn't bouncy, fluffy, and everybody is happy at the ending. It was usually handling just great stories, and the singing takes you all the way through the song of the play. There is no stopping, there is no talking, there is no dialogue. Of course, everything else is there, the dancing and the grandeur of what the musical does. Here's some examples of other types of musicals. So we talked about the book musical. We talked about the type of musical where we have the British invasion, where it's kind of like an operetta, where all the music is connected through song. So the difference between a book musical and the musical work that we get from the Andrew Lloyd Webbers and types is that we don't have the acting and dialogue and singing. Another type of musical is taking popular songs and turning them into a musical, either by a band, either by a concept or an idea. So these are some examples for you to Google and check out. The Mamma Mia's, the Moving Out, Good Vibrations, these are all based on songs by particular people. The difference is these songs were not written for these stories on the stage. They're written on their own ideas. Musicals are songs written for that specific story that's going to be on stage. Last thing we have to say is in the 80s, technology changed everything. Disney came along and saved New York, and the way that they did that was we noticed that things were getting seedy. You had adult shops, you had strip clubs. That was happening on Broadway because everybody had television. Then everybody had the VCR. Now there's no reason to take people downtown to Times Square to see a show. They're on Broadway. So that was a big deal that occurred, and it was the movie musical like what you had seen with the Aladdins and the Little Mermaids, bringing them to Broadway, that actually brought back a lot of the youth to Broadway and really kind of reinvigorated it. So one might say that Walt Disney did kind of restore what's going on Broadway now to where you can bring the whole family to Broadway. Lion King is the most popular one, which is still playing there, and I'll show you segments of that when we talk more about costuming, things of that nature, to get you to understand that. But here are some examples of some things that occurred on that time for that Walt Disney brought to the stage. Okay, so that'll conclude the part 2 for musical theater. Please review this on Monday. We will be having our quiz. We will be doing it at class time. I encourage you to look over the guidelines, and we will just go from there. I'll have an email that'll follow up. Thanks, and if you have any questions, send me an email.